I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mark Medley, professor of theology at Baptist Seminary of Kentucky in Louisville. Prior to joining BSK faculty in 2007, Mark taught in the School of Theology, Campbellsville University, from 99 to 2007. Presently, Mark is serving as theologian in residence at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd, Lexington, Kentucky. He serves on the Justice and Advocacy Committee of the Kentucky Council of Churches and the Liturgical Commission of the Episcopal Diocese of Lexington. Dr. Medley, I am turning it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Addison. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted and honored to be with you. I'm going to share my screen right now because I do have a PowerPoint related to my presentation. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Sultana for the invitation to speak with the Christian-Muslim Dialogue. It's well over a year ago that invitation was extended, and I'm deeply appreciative for the opportunity. I also want to thank Addison for his assistance and coordination with today's meeting. He also needs to be thanked for the catchy title for my presentation today. This was not the original topic that I had planned to address back in April when I was first scheduled to speak with the dialogue. Of course, the pandemic has altered those plans. I had originally planned to talk about how the influence of neoliberalism, especially the concept of commodification, has sort of negatively transformed moral decision-making in public policy and in politics and to a lesser degree in business. I'm going to briefly touch on that topic a little later in connection with what I'm talking about today because there is an intersection, I do believe. The police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery ignited a significant and meaningful wave of public protest against racial injustice and for racial justice across cities and towns throughout our country over the summer. And those protests are continuing today. I imagine most of us are probably watching the news and seeing what is occurring in downtown Louisville in the wake of the grand jury's decision related to Breonna Taylor's case and the unfolding and continuing protests there. At Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, we joined the protest through the creation of a 6-week webinar back in the summer that interrogated anti-Blackness supremacy and called for racial justice. And several persons who are on the are in the meeting today may have been part of that course, of that webinar. I was responsible for leading one of those sessions over the summer. And as I was prepping and preparing and working on my session, I immediately saw parallels and resonances between white supremacy and Christian supremacy, perhaps in ways that I had really, I saw them more clearly than I had in the past. And making the link between how discrimination and dehumanization of Black people in the United States and the discrimination and dehumanization of non-Christian religious peoples, particularly when we think about Muslims in the United States, and how those, how that is intertwined and intertangled. And so I thought it might be helpful and relevant and important to address those connections today. And so when I reached out to Dr. Sultana and to Addison, they were very gracious in allowing me to alter my topic. So what I want to address today is when did God become a white Christian, race, religious pluralism, and a culture of encounter? And I'm thinking this should take around 40 minutes for me to work through my presentation. It's going to largely fall into two large blocks. The first part, I'm going to look at the historical and continual entanglement of white supremacy and Christian supremacy in the United States. My remarks are going to be broad in scope. And then the second part is going to address a culture of encounter as a way of living and of acting that resist white Christian supremacy in our religiously pluralistic society. So, the first slide I have here is by design to juxtapose the image at the top with the text below. The image at the top is from Atlanta's Day of Religious Pluralism from several years ago. If you look closely at the picture, you can see persons who are Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and other religious traditions. And this is, I think, a picture that represents, is in some ways iconographic of our religiously diverse and pluralistic society and culture. And then the text below is really what I'm focusing on in the first part, about the religio-racial project of white Christian supremacy in the history of the United States, as well as this ongoing project, and how white supremacy and how whiteness and Christianity are the twin pillars of this religious racial project that has dominated the history of the United States. In her recent book entitled White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America, religion scholar Kayati Yoshi argues, quote, the pervasive Christian privilege, a pervasive Christian privilege prevails in the United States today, end quote. And her book presents historical and legal and social and cultural and religious arguments to establish that thesis. Christianity, and in particular Protestantism, has been integral to the establishment and the maintenance of U.S. national identity. As Yoshi contends, quote, Christian beliefs, norms, and practices, and indeed a Christian way of looking at the world, infuse American society, enjoying countless legal, structural, and cultural supports, whose roots reach back to the arrival of Europeans and the founding of the nation, end quote. Christianity dominates by setting the tone, assumptions, norms, and rules about who belongs and who doesn't belong, by establishing who are insiders and outsiders. Christianity is deeply embedded in so many of the country's civic, educational, and legal institutions, as well as social and cultural practices. In large measure, Christianity, said Yoshi, quote, has benefited, has and continues to benefit from de facto and de jure state sanction in virtually every aspect of society, end quote. This Christian primacy offers advantages to Christians as they lead their lives and disadvantages for members of other religious groups. Such Christian normativity in the US has always been entangled with white supremacy. In recent memory, one of the most visible and violent manifestations of how whiteness intersects with Christian identity in this racial project of white Christian supremacy was the Unite to Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017. For many, America is supposed to be white and Christian. For many, that represents who founded the country, and that is who remains in the majority. Indeed, throughout US history, Christian and white, argues Yoshi, quote, have been superimposed to form mutually supporting advantages based on the co-construction of religion and race. These advantages and corresponding disadvantages for religious and racial minorities, as well as for the non-religious, persist at both the institutional and individual levels of society, end quote. White Christian privilege and its corresponding racial and religious exclusionary and discriminatory practices are a roadblock to the fulfillment of the promise of equality that were made in the nation's founding documents, later reinforced in additional constitutional amendments and in more recent law and jurisprudence. Yet, unlike racism and gender discrimination and homophobia, Christian privilege often flies under the radar. It's so ingrained in our broader social and cultural dynamics, it continues to be taken as normal or the default, so to speak. In other words, religious affiliation along with race have been and continue to be bases for exclusion and discrimination. whiteness and Christianity have colluded to construct and maintain a tilted playing field against racial and religious minorities. So I want to here talk about an accent. If I take the term white Christian supremacy, I want to accent the term Christian. And I've got here an image from my hometown in North Carolina. This is at the Court Square, and this is a Confederate monument. And in my imagination and in my mind, Confederate monuments are a particular iconic expression of this religio-racial project of white Christian supremacy. So, Black people, people of color, and people of non-Christian religious traditions know that white supremacy, not the religion of Jesus as identified by Howard Thurman in his classic Jesus and the Disinherited, is the dominant religion followed by many white Christians. Professed faith in Jesus did not prevent Christians from committing genocide and land theft against indigenous peoples. Christian faith did not stop white Christians from kidnapping, trafficking, enslaving, brutalizing, raping, lynching, and stealing labor and wages from Africans and African Americans. White Christian professions about mission did not stop them from stealing land owned and settled for generations by Latinx peoples. Fidelity to the Christian gospel did not prevent white Christians from engaging in bigotry and discrimination against immigrant workers and families from Asia. Even before, but especially after 9/11, and most recently during and after the 2016 presidential campaign, the hostile political xenophobic rhetoric of many white Christian Americans has painted Islam as a social contagion and inherently violent and incompatible with life in the US. As Professor Yoshi and as Catholic theologian Janine Hale Fletcher have argued respectively, white Christian supremacy in America is the product of a centuries-long racial project in which notions of white racial superiority and Christian religious superiority have augmented and amplified each other. In a theological register, the intrinsic salvific exclusiveness of Christianity birthed cultural and social antagonisms toward religious difference. That is, this belief undergirded a binary world of Christian and non-Christian, the saved and the damned. And in such a polarized world, anyone who did not adhere to Christian claims were deemed evil or at least inferior. Non-Christians were not only considered outsiders to the truth, but oftentimes understood as enemies. This ideology of Christian supremacy was foundational to the European age of discovery and European colonialization of Africa, Asia, Arabia, Oceania, and the Americas. The racial and religious superiority of Christianity has its roots in the long history of supersessionist desires and actions to appropriate, replace, and take over Jewish text, history, and imaginary on which it depends. Informed by classically trained theologians in the late medieval and early modern eras, supersessionism was the seedbed for theologies and practices of discovery and conquest. These theologies are exemplified in a series of 15th century papal edicts that permitted the Portuguese monarchy to seize West Africa by deeming any land not inhabited by Christians as available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, permitting the enslavement of Muslims, pagans, and other non-believers. This doctrine of discovery legally justified and fueled settler colonialism's endeavors, offering religious sanction for military, racial, and cultural domination. In the US, the doctrine of discovery was the foundation for Western expansion and the construction of the so-called manifest destiny. Christianity thus permeated colonial enterprises around the world, both before and after the colonialization of North America. In all these projects, non-Christians were denied the rights to land, sovereignty, and self-determination enjoyed by Christians. In Europe and later in what would become the US, White Christian supremacy was developed, rationalized, and spread by theologians, philosophers, scientists, and educators. Now, I've been involved in higher education for 25 years, so I'm typically sensitive to how higher education has been a tool for the creation and maintenance of white Christian supremacy. The role of higher ed in the establishment and perpetuation of white Christian superiority cannot be overlooked. As Hill Fletcher maintains, the scholarship of the major universities at the nation's founding, places like Harvard and Yale, Princeton and Brown, was a key element in the strategy to expand Christian domination to the American landscape. Often advancing pseudo-scientific theories of racial hierarchy in coordination with Christian identity, these institutions promoted theologies and ideologies of dispossession that rationalized land theft from native non-Christians and enslavement of African and African Americans, and later fueled exclusionary and discriminatory practices against non-Christian persons and groups of people. The political and the educational architects of what we might call American Christendom employed a theological heritage that to construct a white racial frame to justify the exploitation and domination of non-white, non-Christian people. This way of framing reality rested on a hierarchical cosmology. This cosmology has at its top God, and then below, with it Jesus, and then Christian. And then below that, there was everyone else, ordered in some racial, religious manner. This was a sliding scale of humanity that viewed Christians as recipients of God's favor and non-Christians as cursed by God or deficient in God's eyes, as reflected in melanin and status. And this cosmology and its anthropology, kind of as a form of social capital, signed values of greater and lesser worth to persons and to groups of persons. In this hierarchical order of humanity, non-white and non-Christian others were deemed or viewed detrimental in the sense of, well, they might challenge this prevailing ideology and power of white nation, of the white Christian nation. And simultaneously, they were viewed as instrumental, meaning, oh, these are the people, these are the bodies, and their lives are to be used for the work that would build the nation. Such views regarding the inferiority, and actually the inherent inferiority of non-white, non-Christian peoples was enacted in legislation and policy that created and established and maintained interlocking and structures of systemic and structural white Christian superiority. So if I've been focusing on the word Christian in the phrase white Christian supremacy, let me turn and focus on the word white. The rise of modern European world colonialism was accompanied by the invention of race. Through the invention of race, political and economic domination gained justification by ranking people according to the characteristics of their bodies, most often the lightness and darkness of their skin. My friend and ethicist and theologian Mike Broadway, who teaches at Shaw Divinity School, a historic Black college in Raleigh, North Carolina, has said that this invention of race was above all the invention of whiteness as an idea and categorical standard by which to judge all humanity and culture. In the modern world, the racial stratification from white to Black became a regulatory structure to organize bodies, marking some bodies for power and opportunity and life while marking other bodies for subordination, marginalization, and death. In other words, whiteness is superiority. Whiteness is the ideal. It's the norm against which Black bodies and cultures, Latinx bodies and cultures, Asian bodies and cultures, indigenous bodies and cultures, and the bodies and cultures of non-Christian peoples are judged inferior, substandard, and even subhuman. Whiteness was created and is sustained by processes that reinforce domination and marginalization. In America, whole regulatory systems, think of chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration today, have been created and maintained to ensure the advantage of white people and the subjugation, oppression, and domination of Black people and other peoples. Persistent systemic inequality forms the means of racialization, through which the levers and gears of racial regulatory systems are designed to dehumanize and terrorize Black people as well as non-white peoples. These systems thrive on greed and ambition, lust for power, and the fear of difference. And physical, rhetorical, structural, and institutional violence has been and continues to be used to patrol the borders between whiteness and others. To employ the words by the African thinker Akil Mbembe, whiteness is a way of anchoring and affirming power in white bodies, and at the same time excluding the remainder, that is, the dissimilar and, quote, empty being. Historically, white supremacy emerged from within the polarized world of Christian and non-Christian. Religious difference and superiority transformed into racial difference and racial superiority. A violent and injurious caste system was created through which to see and evaluate others as closer to or from the salvific center of whiteness. A Christian theology of whiteness limits the image of God to those persons of the so-called white race. And so the desire to love one another therefore stops at the racial, and we can also add religious division. In fact, this theology declares that a white person is a human because the white person is not Black or brown or of some other hue. Insidiously, this theology's understanding of the human, equate that with the white person, is dependent on the dispossession and genocide of Native peoples, on the violence of anti-Blackness and the social death of Blackness for its existence and its coherence, and on the sinister suspicion of and violence toward non-white peoples. The theologies of the dominant racial project provide logics to justify whiteness and legitimize material benefit to whites to the exclusion of non-white others. As theologian Christopher Norris says in his recent book, Witnessing Whiteness, Confronting White Supremacy in the American Church, quote, Christian theology developed a collective theological consciousness that sanctions racial oppression. White supremacy is the world the church has made, end quote. So to conclude this first part, racism and religious xenophobia are the children of white supremacy. And white supremacy is the child of Christianity. It may not be exclusively the child of Christianity, but it is the progeny of Christianity. The conquest of the U.S. was a racial, religious, colonial endeavor that combined taking land with the spreading of Christianity. Over the centuries, Christianity was justified in law and social practice, the racial segregation of whites and Blacks. Christian normativity has also been used to rationalize the legal and social exclusion of non-Christian peoples. Today, such normativity perpetuates the societal exclusion of Buddhists and Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs through public resistance to mosques, synagogues, temples, and gurdwaras being built in predominantly white neighborhoods, among other means. The same efforts to police and control space that characterizes the historical and present reality of anti-Blackness supremacy are reflected in the rejection of sharing public space with non-Christian faith traditions. Many white Christian Americans perceive the presence of religious pluralism, especially in civic and public life, as a threat to its very existence. In the historical as well as the present landscape of the U.S., Christianity has functioned intimately in the project of constructing whiteness. Whiteness and Christianity are the two pillars of this religious racial project. The image that you're looking at right now is from a 1972 painting by John Gast. You have here the female figure of Columbia, the female representation for America. And one of the things to notice is that if you move from right to left in the image, or if you move from east to west, you see lightness illuminating the darkness. One can see at the bottom settler colonialism emerging. It's all white. And what one sees there briefly on the left side of the page are Native Americans, indigenous Americans who are fleeing with this westward expansion. This is an image in part that captures, I think, the religious racial project. And perhaps most importantly, in that image of Columbia in the picture. So now I want to turn to the second part of what I want to share with you today, which is to talk about, in response, a culture of encounter. And I want to begin with a personal story. In the mid-1990s, I worked for the Council on Peacemaking in Louisville, Kentucky. The Council on Peacemaking was a nonprofit advocacy organization. The council had its roots in the anti-nuclear war movement of the 1980s and early 1990s. And by the early 1990s, the council had expanded its advocacy work to include conflict resolution and interfaith dialogue. In partnership with the J.B. Speed Art Museum in Louisville, the council developed a program called Interfaith Paths to Peace. The program was funded by a healthy grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. The goal of Interfaith Paths to Peace was to utilize art, especially the visual arts, with a focus on the Speeds collection, as a way to foster interreligious dialogue. Now, I co-directed the program as a staff member at the council, but unfortunately, when the council folded due to financial issues, I joined the staff of the education department at the Speed Museum to continue to direct the program. One of the key principles of the Interfaith Paths to Peace program was to elevate particularity in religious dialogue. It's quite common, or at least it was common when I was involved in the program, for efforts of interreligious dialogue to focus almost exclusively on the commonalities between different faith traditions, a search for shared belief and praxis. Difference, even sharp difference, between religious traditions was avoided. Interfaith Paths to Peace sought to encounter difference. It viewed difference as a wellspring for encountering the richness and the dynamism and the beauty of various religious traditions. It attempted to explore and to understand, to appreciate and respect and embrace the uniqueness and particularity of different of all religious traditions that we've encountered in our community in Louisville through encountering and how encounter was mediated through the arts. An epistemic goal of the program was not so much to resolve those convictional differences between peoples of multiple religious traditions, but to arrive at a greater understanding and knowledge of religious traditions that lived and thrived in our community. Hopefully that epistemic goal led to and cultivated the moral virtues of hospitality and generosity. We must be hospitable and generous because that is how the divine is. So with equality, encourage friendship, the program believed that the arts, especially the visual arts, could be generative of a culture of encounter that aspires for solidarity. And so Interfaith Paths to Peace recognized that encounter and hospitality and solidarity are fundamental to our spiritual, public, and civic life. The program attempted to embody in attitude, in disposition, in action, a generosity of spirit that lies at the core of human encounter, of human hospitality, and human solidarity. And so that personal story informs my religious and moral perspectives on encounter. Undoing white supremacy will require, in part, interrogating and relinquishing the ideologies and theologies of Christian supremacy. And such interrogating and undoing must also be met with developing and enacting theologies of difference and encounter. So to live is to encounter, and to encounter is to live. Our lives are a deep history of encounter with family and friends, with neighbors and coworkers, acquaintances and strangers. Our lives are a deep history of encounter within various forms of community. And these encounters can be affirming and supportive, just, mutual, and loving. And these encounters, sadly, can also be hurtful and wounding and dangerous. But encounters make possible change and offer a glimpse that there's always more to learn about ourselves, about others, about our world, and about the divine. Catholic theologian Marcus Mesher says, quote, each encounter is also an opportunity to become more attentive to and responsive to God, end quote. To borrow language from my Christian tradition, coming face to face with another person, someone wonderfully made in the image of God, is sacramental. To say that encounters are sacramental is to say that encounter is a visible sign of divine invisible grace. Or to put it differently, encountering another person not only reveals the sacred within our midst, it also bears an inexhaustible potential for greater discovery of oneself, of others, and the divine. In other words, how we treat others is how we treat the divine. Of course, at the present, it does not take us long to understand and to realize we are very polarized, we are very divided, we are very fragmented. And there are cultural and social and religious and political and economic forces that are stoking that division. And if social and civic and cultural and religious separation witnesses to a common failure to love God by loving neighbor, then as Mesher says, redemption can be found in encounter. Redemption in encounter doesn't paper over differences in identity, doesn't paper over differences in belief or in experience. Neither does that redemption lie in calling for just simply tolerance. As Mesher contends, to tolerate the existence of another person, often deprived of respect and rights, does nothing to provide for their need. So tolerance doesn't often foster understanding and appreciation of persons who are different from us. Rather, a cure to division and fragmentation, lies in restoring innate and human dignity, repenting for discrimination and exploitation, recognizing our mutual interdependence and galvanizing a shared commitment to the common good. Accomplishing this requires establishing and nurturing a social trust, a trust that is impossible without mutual equality, freedom, dignity, respect, openness, humility, generosity, and responsibility. What's required is a public discourse and a public space built on the peaceful diversity of many, many voices. What's required is a new kind of civic engagement. What's required is a culture of encounter. And that culture and encounter draws or can draw upon the sacred text embraced by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The Jewish discipline of tikkun olam, or to heal the world, involves a commitment to reconciling social divisions and inequalities and a commitment to justice and shalom. And such a discipline is deeply rooted in Jewish prophetic traditions of hospitality and special concern for the marginalized, the widow, the orphaned, and the poor, those denied status and security. Likewise, the Quran is filled with dozens and dozens of verses about honoring the neighbor, showing hospitality to the stranger, and serving those in need. As the Muslim scholar Sayyid Hossein Nasser says, quote, Muslims call on Allah, the infinitely good and most merciful. names with which daily human acts are consecrated because the aim of the Quranic revelation has been to create a compassionate society, end quote. Now, I've been reading from Mona Siddiqui's it's a wonderful book, Hospitality, Islam and Hospitality. Dr. Siddiqui is professor of Islamic and interreligious studies in the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And she maintains in her book that in the Quran itself, there is no particular narrative about hospitality. Hospitality is not a singular concept, but several concepts involving various kinds of people and various kinds of relationships. Vast resources are present in Islamic thought and piety, which speak of charity and neighborliness and giving, all key ingredients to a culture of encounter. Of particular interest to me, Siddiqui maintains that however ambiguous the concept of stranger and the status of stranger was in the medieval Muslim world, the attitude to stranger was not xenophobic. In other words, the stranger was not viewed as a problem as the stranger was viewed in classical antiquity. I find that statement remarkable and very hopeful. Even in my own Christian tradition, talk of the stranger, I think, often presumes xenophobia. Commands to be hospitable often imply that persons who should be welcoming of strangers typically are worried about the stranger or fearful of the stranger. The stranger is the problem. In contrast, in Islamic thought, the stranger, says Siddiqui, quote, seems relatively less problematic, end quote. The stranger, the other, is not the problem at all. The virtue of hospitality lies at the heart, she says, of the Islamic ethical system. And she draws from the Prophet, who is reported to have said, quote, there is no good in the one who is not hospitable. And in Islam, she says, the stranger embodies the presence of God and brings blessing in multiple ways. So cultivating a culture of encounter should draw deeply from the well of such Islamic thought. Now, here's where I want to take a very short digression and touch on the original topic that I was going to address back in April, because I do believe there is an intersection. So let me say something about neoliberalism. In concert with the white Christian racial project, there is one very, very strong socioeconomic and political factor that stands against a culture of encounter, and it's neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, or market or corporate capitalism, or quote, the market, has become all present and all powerful in our culture. The market takes on divine qualities and attributes. Neoliberalism functions to concentrate economic benefit and power in the hands of a few elite at the expense of everyone else. And it can be argued that it has become the dominant mythology of our present age that supervenes on the personal and the social. In other words, it's become kind of like a universal solvent that reduces relationships to their economic terms. Relationships and relational complexity are turned into purely selfish calculation designed to maximize benefit to oneself. So neoliberalism has turned, and from economic theory, rational choice theory, with its talk about cost-benefit assessment of economic utility, into a human universal. It has been superimposed on every kind of human enterprise. A Christian theologian and ethicist D. Stephen Long, in his book entitled Divine Economy, maintains that the market tempts us to reduce everything which is true, good, and beautiful to a formal value based on usefulness and substitutability. Neoliberal economics has come to operate in our decision-making as economic values are embedded in social and cultural practices. When economic utility and calculated self-interest operate as criteria to assess our personal, our familial, social, and spiritual lives, that neoliberalism has captured our imagination. We are primed to imagine non-market activities in terms of competition, and competition is understood as the underlying condition of our social existence. One example of the way neoliberalism has penetrated our thinking would be from our former governor, Matt Bevin, in his approach to higher education. State-supported universities were understood to produce students ready to compete in the marketplace. Pressure was exerted by his administration on colleges and universities, and especially liberal arts curriculums, to abandon all aims and ends other than making students, quote, shovel ready, end quote, when they graduated. And one last point about neoliberalism. It's racist. Neoliberalism works hand in hand with the white racial frame I described earlier. Hidden in plain sight has been the use of systemic and strategic racism to consolidate political and economic power for the few at the expense of everyone else. This strategy coerces the white working class to maintain the status quo and sacrifice potential economic advancement in exchange for the solidification of racial hierarchies and the maintenance of white dominance in society. Rugged individualism, market economics, personal responsibility, for example, all present a kind of really nice narrative that says through hard work and initiative, anyone's story can become a rags to riches story. And this narrative presumes that markets work by being fair, they're self-regulating, and they're colorblind. And they're the arbiter of our effort, our hard work, our ingenuity. But an honest and sobering confession of historical white Christian supremacy would counter the neoliberal frame that characterizes Black, brown, and poor peoples as undeserving, and instead pave the way for narratives that accurately frame inequality and poverty as grounded in resource and economic dispossession, deprivation, and exploitation. So let me conclude by returning to a culture of encounter. A culture of encounter envisions a new understanding of belonging. It's a revolution of the intimate, a necessary vision for a pluralistic, diverse culture that is our present and our future. A culture of encounter, says Mesher, quote, involves commitment to mercy as well as, quote, the inclusive fidelity of solidarity and the persistence of hope for a future, a new future, one where everyone belongs and flourishes. When we imagine encounter, we may envision it as taking place between two people. But a culture of encounter is much more than that. It's a communal approach. It's a collective commitment to people to break down walls, build bridges, and create opportunities for meaningful gatherings. By now, you may be thinking that what I mean by a culture of encounter is neighborliness, and you would be correct. A culture of encounter rests upon the fundament that we see one another, each other, as a human being, as a human neighbor. We are all bound. We are all to be neighbors to one another. Our care and love for neighbors is to know no bounds. And relatedly, we are always and everywhere obligated to act as a neighbor. There are no loopholes to avoid acting neighborly. And this means we are open to receiving others, no matter who they are, in order to build mutually respectful, responsible, and inclusive relationships, thus widening the scope of otherness and belonging. And acting neighborly includes the hard work of healing wounds, righting wrongs, of working for peace in order to foster right relationships, solidarity, and a just ordering of our society. Doing so requires that we act with courage and mercy, humility, generosity, and compassion. A culture of encounter, a culture rooted in neighborliness and the practice of being a neighbor, urges us to expand our imagination, reaching for otherwise possibilities in practicing mercy, generosity, and cultivating solidarity. Such a culture calls for the cultivation of a critical consciousness, attending to suffering and injustice experienced by neighbors, local and global. It demands a willingness to confront unjust attitudes, dispositions, and actions, personal and social, that dehumanize, exclude, and undermine bonds of human solidarity. It demands analyzing structures and systems from the vantage point of the marginalized, the excluded, and the dispossessed. A culture of encounter, then, demands an active commitment to foster a more inclusive solidarity through relationships and networks and communities that promote human dignity, equality, rights, and responsibilities for the common good, local and global. In the end, what we need to build a culture of encounter rooted in an invitation I learned as a child. Won't you be my neighbor? Thank you.